What if Japan joined the Allies in WW2? Imagine a world where one of the most powerful Axis nations, Imperial Japan, did not march alongside Germany and Italy, but instead aligned itself with the Allies. The thought alone reshapes the trajectory of the Second World War, altering not only the balance of power in the Pacific, but also the very foundation of global alliances in the mid-20th century. To understand how dramatic this divergence could have been, we must first set the stage in the years leading up to Pearl Harbor, when Japan's choices were not yet fully locked in. At the dawn of the 1930s, Japan stood as an ambitious empire. It had modernized rapidly after the Meiji Restoration and emerged victorious in conflicts against both China in 1895 and Russia in 1905. These victories gave Japan not only territorial expansion, but also the confidence that it could compete with Western powers. Yet behind its military successes lay vulnerabilities, a lack of natural resources, particularly oil, iron, and rubber. These resources were essential for sustaining industrial growth and military ambitions. This scarcity would later become the decisive factor pushing Japan into confrontation with Western colonial powers. But what if, instead of seeing the Western powers as obstacles to expansion, Japan had sought cooperation? Imagine that instead of the invasion of Manchuria in 1931, Japan chose diplomacy, using its growing influence to secure economic partnerships rather than military conquests. Such a choice would have been difficult, for nationalism and militarism were surging inside the country. Still, an alternate path was possible. The Japanese elite, divided between moderate diplomats and radical militarists, could have shifted balance if key leaders had recognized the long-term risks of antagonizing the United States and Britain. Now, let us examine how this alliance might have formed. By the late 1930s, the geopolitical situation was tense. Germany's rise under Adolf Hitler was alarming not only to France and Britain, but also to nations outside Europe. The Soviet Union remained a looming force, spreading communist ideology and controlling vast territories rich in resources. Japan had already clashed with the Soviets at the Battle of Khalkhin Gol in 1939, suffering a sharp defeat. In reality, this loss pushed Japan away from conflict with the USSR and deeper into the Southern Expansion Doctrine, leading eventually to Pearl Harbor. But in our alternate timeline, the defeat at Khalkhin Gol becomes the turning point that redirects Japanese strategy. Rather than expanding southward into Southeast Asia and the Pacific, Japan doubles down on its anti-communist stance. Japanese leaders recognize that a war with the United States would be disastrous, but a war against the Soviet Union could serve their ideological and strategic goals, especially if they align with Britain and the U.S., who were also wary of Stalin. If Japanese diplomacy had offered cooperation to London and Washington, emphasizing mutual opposition to communism, the Allies might have seen value in securing Japan as a partner rather than an enemy. Consider how this might have changed the early years of the war. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Britain and France declared war. In our timeline, Japan was not directly involved, but in this alternate reality, Japan could position itself as a non-European member of the Allied coalition, pledging naval support in the Pacific and intelligence operations against Soviet influence in Asia. Suddenly, the Allies gained not only Britain's fleet, but also Japan's Imperial Navy, one of the most advanced maritime forces of the time. The immediate impact would be profound. Instead of preparing for conflict with the U.S. Pacific Fleet, Japan could redirect its naval power to patrol sea lanes against Axis or Soviet threats. American war planners, rather than keeping one eye on Tokyo, could focus entirely on supporting Britain in Europe. This unity would significantly shorten the phony war period and accelerate the flow of resources across the Atlantic. Meanwhile, China's fate would shift dramatically. In our history, Japan invaded China in 1937, committing itself to a brutal, drawn-out conflict. In the alternate timeline, Tokyo chooses negotiation, perhaps recognizing Chiang Kai-shek's government as a bulwark against communism. A partnership between Japan and China, though fragile, could have formed if both sides saw mutual benefit in resisting Soviet expansion. This alone would eliminate one of the bloodiest fronts of the Second World War, freeing Japan's resources for Allied operations. But the most critical consequence lies in the relationship with the Soviet Union. With Japan aligned against Stalin, the USSR would be trapped in a two-front nightmare long before Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa. Imagine the pressure. Germany attacking from the west, while Japan threatens Siberia from the east. The Soviet Union's capacity to survive would shrink drastically. The industrial relocation from European Russia to Siberia, a key factor in its real survival, would be endangered if Japan controlled Manchuria and advanced into Siberian territory. This alignment would completely rewrite the balance of power by 1941. Instead of a desperate Britain standing alone, the Allies would have an Asian partner with significant military power. Instead of a United States debating whether to enter the war, Washington might feel less threatened and more willing to lend support early, seeing that Japan was already cooperating rather than challenging them in the Pacific. Germany, meanwhile, would face not only the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy, but also the looming specter of a hostile Japan preventing any potential Soviet-German cooperation in Asia. Of course, such an alliance would not come without complications. Japan's imperial ambitions could not vanish overnight. Tensions with Britain over colonies in Southeast Asia would remain, as would American suspicion of Japanese motives. Yet, diplomacy and mutual recognition of limits might have kept these tensions in check, especially if the greater threat of fascism and communism demanded unity. Thus, by the early 1940s, our alternate world sees a war with dramatically different contours. No Pearl Harbor, no Pacific Island hopping campaigns. Instead, the Japanese Navy sails alongside the Royal Navy, projecting power across Asia and keeping vital shipping routes safe. In Europe, the Soviet Union faces pressure on two fronts, making survival increasingly uncertain. And in Washington, the United States sees an opportunity. Supporting Britain and Japan simultaneously, without the fear of direct attack, could bring the war to a quicker resolution. This is the foundation of the alternate timeline, where Japan joins the Allies. The stage is set for a world war, unlike the one we know won, where the balance of power shifts from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and where the survival of the Soviet Union becomes the central question of global history. As the 1940s unfold in this alternate timeline, the alignment of Japan with the Allies radically reshapes the struggle in Europe and Asia. The most immediate and dramatic shift centers on the fate of the Soviet Union. In our reality, Joseph Stalin's regime survived because the USSR had time and space to relocate its industries eastward, beyond the reach of the advancing German Wehrmacht. Siberia became the heart of Soviet resilience, producing tanks, planes, and ammunition far from the battle lines. But in this alternate scenario, the very region that gave the USSR life is now under pressure from the east. With Japan acting as an allied partner, operations against the Soviet Union begin not as a clash of ideology alone, but as a strategic campaign coordinated with Britain and potentially even Germany's enemies. Though the Western Allies historically distrusted Japan, their cooperation in this version of events is shaped by necessity. Stalin, boxed in by Hitler on one side and Japan on the other, poses a problem too dangerous for London and Washington to ignore. Japan, in turn, sees this as an opportunity to gain influence in Asia without risking conflict with America. Imagine Japan launching a massive campaign into Siberia in late 1941, not as an opportunistic move, but as part of a larger Allied plan. While Hitler drives toward Moscow from the west, Japanese armies press into the Far East, targeting Vladivostok and key supply hubs along the Trans-Siberian Railway. Without this railway functioning, Soviet mobility and supply chains fracture. Stalin's ability to move troops from Siberia to defend Moscow vanishes. and the famous Siberian divisions that saved the Soviet capital in December 1941 never arrive. The result is catastrophic for the USSR. Moscow may very well fall, not just because of German strength, but because Japanese pressure makes reinforcement impossible. But this raises a critical question. Would Germany and the Allies tolerate fighting on the same side against the Soviet Union? At first, it may seem implausible. Britain and the United States despised Hitler and the Nazi regime. Joining forces with Germany against Stalin would be unacceptable. Yet the alternate scenario does not require direct coordination with Berlin. Instead, the Allies and Germany inadvertently pressure the USSR from both sides simultaneously without ever forming a partnership. To the Kremlin, it makes little difference. Two great powers are pressing from opposite directions, threatening to crush the Soviet state. The fall of Moscow would reverberate across the globe. In Europe, Germany suddenly controls the heart of the Soviet Union. With Japan attacking from the east, Stalin has fewer safe zones to retreat to, and the massive industrial migration eastward becomes unfeasible. Factories, machinery, and workers that historically relocated to the Urals and Siberia may be captured or destroyed. Soviet resistance becomes fragmented, and while guerrilla warfare would continue, the centralized power of the Soviet state would face collapse. In London and Washington, the situation sparks a dilemma. On the one hand, the collapse of the Soviet Union eliminates a major continental counterweight to Germany. On the other hand, with Japan now aligned, the Allies possess unprecedented naval dominance and can prioritize a direct buildup in Western Europe. This could mean that instead of waiting until 1944 to open a second front, the Allies begin their European campaign earlier, perhaps even by 1942 or 1943. With Japanese ships patrolling the Pacific and British fleets guarding the Atlantic, Allied logistics become far more secure, accelerating the timetable of operations. Meanwhile, in Asia, Japan's alliance transforms the balance of power. The British Empire, under severe strain in our timeline from Japanese offensives in Malaya, Burma, and Hong Kong, now breathes easier. Instead of losing Singapore in 1942, Britain maintains its stronghold, supported by Japanese naval cooperation. Southeast Asia remains under Allied control, ensuring a steady flow of resources, rubber, tin, and oil, that historically fell into Japanese hands. This strengthens the Allied war machine and prevents Japan from becoming isolated. China, too, experiences a very different fate. In this alternate path, Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government does not endure years of war against Japanese invaders. Instead, China stabilizes under a tenuous partnership with Tokyo, focusing its efforts on resisting communist insurgency within its borders rather than fighting a total war. This removes one of the bloodiest theaters of the Second World War, potentially saving millions of lives and allowing China to emerge from the war stronger and more united. For the United States, the implications are enormous. Without Pearl Harbor, there is no sudden shock pulling Washington into the war in December 1941. Instead, America's entry into the conflict might come more gradually, influenced by political debates and strategic necessity rather than direct attack. Yet the U.S. would still feel compelled to act. Britain remains under siege in Europe, and the opportunity to stabilize Asia with Japan as an ally provides a unique chance to influence the post-war world. Roosevelt could push for intervention earlier than in our timeline, framing it as a united struggle against totalitarianism, first against Hitler, and later perhaps even against Stalin if Soviet power collapses. The transformation of the war's timeline cannot be overstated. With Japan aligned with the Allies, supply chains are more secure, colonies remain intact, and Soviet collapse becomes increasingly likely. The great question now becomes, if the USSR falls under combined pressure, who controls its vast territories and resources? Will Germany dominate Eurasia, or will the Allies and Japan carve influence across Siberia? The answer to that question will shape the entire post-war order. The war is no longer the same struggle we know. It has become a contest not only to defeat Hitler, but also to determine the fate of the Soviet Union and the division of global power afterward. As the Soviet Union weakens under the pressure of two fronts, the war in Europe unfolds in a radically different rhythm. Without the Red Army's massive resistance, Germany finds itself facing a much lighter burden in the East. Yet this does not mean an easy victory. Occupying vast territories requires manpower, resources, and constant suppression of unrest. Guerrilla resistance, partisan warfare, and the sheer geography of Russia still pose obstacles, but the collapse of centralized Soviet power changes everything. For Britain, the situation is both a relief and a cause for alarm. On one hand, a weakened Soviet Union means that Hitler has fewer enemies to balance against. On the other, Germany now has the chance to consolidate control over much of continental Europe without fear of being crushed by a two-front war. This prospect terrifies Winston Churchill, who always believed that the destruction of Hitler's regime was the only acceptable outcome. A Germany dominant across Europe and Western Russia would represent not just a threat to Britain, but to the entire global order. Enter Japan, now operating as a formal partner of the Allies. Its navy patrols the Pacific and Indian Oceans, securing shipping lanes that in our timeline were constantly under threat. British colonies in Asia, particularly India, Malaya, and Hong Kong, remain far more stable. Supplies of raw materials continue flowing into the Allied war machine. This allows Britain to maintain its industrial output, feeding not only its own needs, but also supporting American production once the United States commits fully to the conflict. And America does commit, though not through the shocking entrance of Pearl Harbor. Instead, U.S. involvement builds gradually, shaped by the recognition that Britain and Japan cannot hold Germany at bay alone. Roosevelt's administration leverages public opinion by highlighting the need to stop Hitler-IS expansion before it engulfs the world. By 1942, American forces are preparing for large-scale involvement in Europe, but with one major difference. They do so without needing to fight a bloody Pacific War at the same time. This frees up enormous resources. The carriers, battleships, and marine divisions that historically fought island-hopping campaigns from Guadalcanal to Okinawa now remain available for operations in Europe or for securing the Middle East. American military planners can focus on a concentrated transatlantic campaign, while Japanese naval power ensures that the Pacific remains calm. With the Soviet Union collapsing, the Allied strategy shifts. The question is no longer whether to save Stalin, but how to prevent Germany from becoming unchallengeable. Plans for a cross-channel invasion accelerate. In our timeline, D-Day was delayed until 1944 because Britain and the U.S. needed time to build up strength while the Soviets absorbed German attacks. Here, with Japan covering the Pacific and America free of that burden, the buildup progresses faster. By late 1942 or early 1943, the Allies are already preparing for an invasion of France. This invasion, however, faces a very different Germany. Without the Soviet Union draining its manpower, Hitler can shift divisions westward, fortifying the Atlantic Wall earlier and more heavily. The Wehrmacht is still stretched thin by the vastness of occupied territories, but it has more freedom to maneuver. Thus, while the Allies prepare for an earlier D-Day, the landing is met with greater resistance than in our reality. The struggle on the beaches of northern France could become far bloodier, with German defenses more entrenched. Meanwhile, Japan continues to exploit its role as an Allied partner. By positioning itself as the protector of Asia against communist expansion, it secures a powerful seat at the table of Allied decision-making. Tokyo avoids the devastation that historically came from years of total war with the United States. Its cities remain intact, its population largely shielded from aerial bombardment. Instead of facing occupation after the war, Japan positions itself as a victorious power, rivaling Britain in influence within Asia. This leads to a remarkable irony. The same empire that once sought dominance through conquest now achieves it through alliance. By controlling sea lanes, maintaining stability in East Asia, and participating in the suppression of Soviet power, Japan strengthens its post-war bargaining power. It becomes not a defeated nation, but one of the architects of the new global order. For Germany, the stakes rise dramatically. Even with the Soviet Union collapsing, Hitler faces the combined might of the United States, Britain, and Japan. This coalition commands overwhelming naval dominance and industrial superiority. The Nazi regime can occupy territory, but holding it against the world's greatest industrial powers proves unsustainable. Slowly but surely, the Allies tighten the noose, planning to liberate France while simultaneously threatening Germany's periphery in North Africa, Italy, and the Balkans. The war is no longer a question of survival for Britain, as it was in 1940. Instead, it becomes a contest of time, whether the Allies can land and liberate Europe before Germany consolidates its eastern conquests. The pressure builds, and the outcome of this alternate war hinges on how quickly the Allies can mount a decisive strike against Fortress Europe. And yet, behind every military decision looms a deeper question. What happens after the war? If the Soviet Union collapses entirely, leaving a vacuum across Eurasia, who will control those territories? Will Germany hold them? Will the Allies intervene? Or will Japan, as an allied partner with armies already pressing into Siberia, claim vast swathes of land for itself? The answer will determine not only the outcome of the war, but the shape of the post-war world order. By 1943, in this alternate timeline, the war reaches a turning point. The Soviet Union has fractured under the combined weight of German offensives in the West and Japanese pressure in the East. Stalin's government struggles to maintain cohesion, and while pockets of resistance continue, the Soviet Red Army no longer functions as a centralized force. For the Allies, this presents both a danger and an opportunity. Germany's Eastern Front is no longer the meat grinder that consumed millions of soldiers, but it also means Hitler can redirect his strength toward the West. The United States, Britain, and Japan now accelerate their efforts to launch a cross-channel invasion. Unlike in our timeline, where D-Day took place in 1944 after years of buildup, the Allies prepare for an assault by late 1942 or 1943. Their combined naval power gives them logistical advantages, and Japan's fleet ensures the Pacific remains stable, freeing American forces to commit entirely to Europe. Yet the challenge is immense. Germany, no longer facing the Red Army in full force, is able to concentrate divisions along the Atlantic coast. As the invasion begins, the beaches of northern France become scenes of extraordinary intensity. The Atlantic Wall, reinforced earlier and with more manpower, makes landings far more difficult. The Allies' overwhelming naval superiority ensures that they can deliver men and material across the channel, but the price is high. Casualties mount, and the battle for a foothold in France drags out longer than in our timeline. Still, industrial superiority begins to tell. The United States, with its factories running at full capacity, pours tanks, trucks, and aircraft into Europe. Britain coordinates planning and intelligence, while Japan contributes not only naval patrols but also intelligence networks in Asia, ensuring no German attempts at alliances with peripheral powers succeed. Once a beachhead is secured, the push inland is grueling. German forces, bolstered by divisions freed from the east, put up stiff resistance. Yet the Allies, unlike in 1940, have overwhelming resources and coordination. Strategic bombing campaigns continue to erode German industry, targeting oil production, transport hubs, and manufacturing centers. The Luftwaffe, already strained, struggles to defend both western skies and long eastern supply lines. Slowly, the tide begins to turn. Meanwhile, Japan's role grows increasingly complex. By advancing into Siberia as part of the Allied coalition, Japan now holds vast stretches of territory once under Soviet control. This expansion grants Tokyo enormous bargaining power within the alliance. Britain and the United States begin to view Japan not merely as an ally, but as a power whose post-war ambitions may clash with their own. Tensions simmer quietly beneath the surface. How much land should Japan hold, and what influence will it claim in the New World Order? For now, wartime necessity overrides these concerns, but they remain unresolved questions that will resurface once victory is achieved. Germany, facing a two-pronged disaster, finds itself stretched thin. In the East, remnants of Soviet resistance and partisan fighters continue to sap strength. In the West, the Allied invasion slowly advances through France. The Mediterranean also remains active, with Allied forces pressing through Italy and threatening southern Europe. By 1944, Hitler is confronted with the nightmare scenario. Enemies on every side, industrial collapse, and diminishing resources. Yet the difference in this alternate history is stark. Without a surviving Soviet Union, there is no massive Red Army poised to sweep into Berlin from the east. Instead, the fate of Germany rests on whether the Western Allies, supported by Japan, can sustain their momentum. The liberation of France becomes the crucial test. Once Paris falls, the drive toward the Rhine begins, with American and British divisions pushing relentlessly forward. For civilians across occupied Europe, the war takes on a different tone. Resistance movements that in our reality coordinated with both the Allies and the Soviets now rely solely on Western support. Supplies, weapons, and intelligence flow from Britain and America, while Japan, though distant, provides indirect aid by keeping the Eastern balance secure. The promise of liberation feels both closer and more uncertain, as the absence of a Soviet front means Germany can fight longer in the West. By the time the Allies reach the German border, the Reich is weakened but not destroyed. Hitler's hopes of a miracle weapon, from advanced jets to rocket technology, grow more desperate. Without the crushing weight of a Soviet invasion, Germany may endure longer, forcing the Allies into an extended war of attrition. Yet the overwhelming economic advantage of the United States, combined with Britain's resilience and Japan's partnership, leaves little doubt about the ultimate outcome. In Asia, Japan's new position as an allied power reshapes regional dynamics entirely. Instead of waging war across the Pacific Islands, it consolidates influence over Siberia and northern China, working alongside Allied strategists to secure resources and block any resurgence of Soviet influence. This positions Japan as a dominant force in Asia, ensuring that when victory finally comes, it will claim a seat at the highest table of negotiations. The trajectory of the war is clear. Germany cannot win, but its defeat will look profoundly different without the Soviet Union's role. The question is no longer whether Hitler falls, but who will control the peace that follows. By 1945, in this alternate history, the world is standing on the edge of a profound transformation. Germany, battered from all sides, no longer possesses the ability to sustain a prolonged war. The Allied coalition, now including the United States, Britain, and Japan, presses relentlessly toward the heart of Europe. Yet without the Soviet Union, the path to victory is slower, more costly, and politically far more complex. The Western Allies finally cross the Rhine, unleashing massive offensives that drive German forces back toward their capital. In this scenario, the battle for Berlin unfolds differently than in our reality. Instead of Soviet tanks smashing through from the east, it is American, British, and Canadian divisions leading the assault, with logistical and intelligence support indirectly aided by Japan. The iconic end of the war changes. The Soviet flag never flies above the Reichstag, and instead, the Western Allies take sole responsibility for dismantling the Nazi state. For Hitler, the absence of a Soviet invasion might have briefly fueled hope, but by this stage, Germany is collapsing internally. Strategic bombing campaigns have shattered transportation networks, oil supplies are nearly gone, and morale among both soldiers and civilians has broken. Facing the reality of encirclement, German leadership fractures, with some attempting desperate peace negotiations while others cling to hopeless resistance. Eventually, Berlin falls under Allied control, sealing the fate of the Reich. The war in Europe ends not with two great armies converging on Germany from east and west, but with the Western Allies and their Japanese partners dictating the terms of surrender. The absence of a Soviet occupation zone profoundly changes post-war Europe. Germany is divided under Western supervision only, and Eastern Europe, which in our timeline fell under Soviet influence, instead remains within the Western sphere. Countries like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia never experienced decades of communist rule. Instead, they are reshaped under Allied oversight, creating a Europe that is more unified under Western institutions from the very beginning. The geopolitical map of the world now shifts dramatically. Japan, having contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union and secured vast tracts of Siberia, emerges from the war not as a defeated nation under American occupation, but as a victorious ally sitting at the negotiating table. Tokyo demands recognition of its territorial gains, its status as a dominant Asian power, and a permanent voice in shaping the post-war order. This places Japan alongside the United States and Britain as one of the three central architects of the New World System. Without the Cold War dividing East and West, the United Nations forms under very different circumstances. There is no Iron Curtain, no Berlin Wall, and no superpower standoff between Washington and Moscow. Instead, the balance of power rests among three great blocs: the United States, Britain with its Commonwealth, and Japan dominating Asia. While cooperation remains strong in the immediate aftermath of victory, tensions quickly surface. The Western allies begin to worry about Japan's long-term ambitions, particularly its grip over China and Siberia. Japan, for its part, grows uneasy with American economic dominance and Britain's efforts to preserve colonial influence in Asia. This fragile alliance leads to a very different kind of post-war tension. Instead of a Cold War defined by ideology, capitalism versus communism, the world may face a new rivalry defined by spheres of influence. Would the United States and Japan remain long-term partners, or would their competing interests eventually bring them into confrontation? The seeds of that question are planted the moment Germany surrenders. For ordinary people across Europe and Asia, the aftermath is a strange mix of relief and uncertainty. In Europe, liberation arrives without Soviet occupation, sparing millions from decades of authoritarian rule. In Asia, however, Japan's expanded empire changes the fate of millions, with its dominance extending across territories it once sought through conquest, now legitimized by its status as an Allied victor. The peace that follows may be less about cooperation and more about negotiations over who truly controls the future. Ultimately, this alternate timeline reminds us of how fragile and interconnected history is. The decision of Japan to join the Allies instead of attacking them would not only have shortened some parts of the war, but also eliminated the Soviet Union as a post-war power. That single shift would rewrite the second half of the 20th century, erasing the Cold War as we know it, and replacing it with an uncertain balance of power among the United States, Britain, and Japan. The world we live in today, our borders, our alliances, even our global culture, would be almost unrecognizable. So the question remains, if Japan had stood alongside the Allies instead of opposing them, would the 20th century have been more peaceful? Or would a different kind of rivalry have plunged the world into yet another struggle for dominance?